Just a note on accessibility. From now on, we are uploading music-free versions of each episode. You can find those at our blog, jetpack.zoob.net or jetpack.zoob.net. The blog post for each episode features an embedded player with a music-free version. And you can also find transcripts of a number of our episodes pinned to the top of the blog.
Where's the end of war? Freedom from disease. Where's the milk and honey? See the shining sea. And where are the crime-free cities? Rockets on our backs. And where are the smooth-moving sidewalks? Hey, where's my jet?
Before we start, I'd just like to take a moment to thank our sponsors. Antifa Incorporated has everything, stocking a wide range of clothing from black hoodies to black masks, literature ranging from the Communist Manifesto to Das Kapital, and soup for your family with ingredients ranging from potato to kumara. Head to antifa.org and enter the promo code JETPACK at checkout for a 100% five-finger discount. Kia ora, hello comrades, welcome to Where's My Jetpack, a politics and pop culture podcast with sci-fi and socialist leanings. We broadcast from the No Fate Project HQ, Dyer Station, Antarctica, on the last Saturday of every month. I'm Annie White, and we're on the line to my sexually frustrating co-host, Derek Johnson.
Thank you, Ani. You're frustrating too. And hola, comrades. This month, we're interviewing Gavan Titley on his book, Is Free Speech Racist?, which deals with the contemporary corruption of free speech as a concept mainly deployed to defend racism and other forms of bigotry. So last month, we asked if tanky politics are racist. This month, we're asking if free speech is racist. We're open to suggestions of a third installment in the Is X Racist trilogy. But first, some Rex.
On topic, I'm going to recommend the book this episode is based around, Is Free Speech Racist? By Gavan Titley. It's a great little polemic. Often I was thrilled somebody was finally saying this stuff in print. The sort of things I've ranted to my friends privately. It was good to see them in book form. And the ebook starts at just $10. Also a YouTube video, Where Do We Go From Here? By Renegade Cut. This is basically about the Capitol Hill uprising, attempted coup, whatever you want to call it.
Terrorist attack.
Yeah, it goes into the politics of it and who was mobilizing, why they were mobilizing, and lessons to take from it. And thought it was a good, straightforward kind of breakdown of it.
Yeah, and I want to recommend Robert Evans' Behind the Bastards podcast. Parts 1 and 2 of Mark Zuckerberg should be on trial for crimes against humanity, showing how deadly Facebook's hiding behind free speech truly is, and how inconsistent enforcement of the TOS that tends to punish the marginalized and the left while giving cover to violent racists and Holocaust deniers, and enables election tampering, fascism, genocides, and persecutions around the world.
An interesting example of that recently, the Capitol Hill attack. Obviously after that, some of these social media giants were finally kind of forced to do something. But in New Zealand, we saw some people echo talking points. So I saw someone on a comment on a news thread saying we should be doing what they're doing at the Capitol here in New Zealand. And I reported that comment. It did get taken down, unusually. But then soon after, the National Party meme page, and this is the opposition party, kind of the equivalent to the Republicans, their meme page posted the same thing, just saying we should be doing the same thing here. We should assault Parliament. that was reported by a lot of people and not taken down. So it was interesting, this one random person on a news thread saying it was illegitimate, but the meme page for a major political party saying it was legitimate. That was a very interesting case of Facebook's very often strange, inconsistent in terms of service enforcement. We also recently saw Facebook strangely ban all news websites in Australia in retaliation against a law that sought to charge them for hosting news. So while I'm all for campaigning to no platform fascists, the fact that such a pernicious corporation is able to mediate access to information for so many people is certainly a problem. But off the factual, I guess, my pop cultural rec this month is the classic Spike Lee flick, Do the Right Thing. I think I've mentioned it before, and to some of you this will be very well known. You know, if you're cinema fans, it might be well known to you. If you're a Public Enemy fan, it might be well known to you. But if it's slipped through the cracks, you're not a movie buff or what have you, it's very, very good. It's a portrayal of basically a baking hot day in late 80s Brooklyn with Public Enemies fight the power, blasting nearly non-stop, and racial tensions building up to a crescendo. And it's just a movie that everyone needs to see, I think. But Spike Lee can be pretty variable. I think he's long past his prime, but Do the Right Thing is excellent. It's firmly in my top 5 movies ever. So for anti-racist cinema, Do the Right Thing, I think, is essential.
It's also based on a true story from before the time of that movie, inspiring police violence against a black man. I would not just recommend this movie, but recommend Public Enemy's, their album, Fear of a Black Planet, to go with this as well.
One thing about the climax, I guess this is kind of a spoiler.
Don't spoil the movie.
Well, you kind of already said, you kind of already implied what happens. But I guess there's a debate about whether the riot is justifiable. And the point that's been made, I think by Spike Lee, was that, well, why don't people talk about the event that triggered the riot? Why is it about whether the riot is justified? So I think that's a thing to keep in mind at the end, not what is the riot justified, but about the event that triggers it. Yeah, anyway, very, very good movie.
And also, I would recommend the Innuendo Studios alt-right playbook series on YouTube. Those are very good on how the alt-right has basically carried forward and gotten the same playbook that fascists have probably been using since the 20s and 30s. Just updated it for the internet and meme culture. Yeah, it's a lot of the devices that we'll kind of be talking about tonight, the ways that they win over normies. It's definitely worth a look. The very effective, unfortunately, talking points that they're able to generate, I agree. And as always, these recs are linked at the blog post for this episode at jetpack.zoob.net. For your meat space recs, get vaccinated if you can, reach out to somebody if you need to. Wear a mask over, not under your nose. I see a lot of people wearing it under their nose. Wear 2 masks, they're saying now. Right. Well, at least cover your nose and don't talk to cops.
A-cab.
This month, we're interviewing Gavan Titley from Dublin, Ireland. Gavin is a senior lecturer in media studies in Maynooth University and a research fellow in the Swedish School of Social Science at University of Helsinki. His most recent book is Free Speech Racist? By Polity Press, 2020, which forms the basis for this discussion. Other works include Racism in Media by Sage Publications in 2019, The Crises of Multiculturalism, Racism in a Neoliberal Age with Elena Lenton, Zed Books, 2011, and the co-edited After Charlie Hebdo, Terror, Racism, Free Speech, Zed Books, 2017. His academic commitments have always been shaped by his engagement in youth work, anti-racist education, and campaigning. Welcome to the show, Gavin.
Thank you very much, Annie and Derek. It's a pleasure to be here. You know what I mean by being here, but I'm here.
Thanks for coming on. So we'll start with, what does free speech mean, and does it mean just one thing?
Yeah, it's always good to start with a nice, easy one. So I've written this book with this, not at all provocative title, is Free Speech Racist? But of course, a large part of the discussion in the book, or a large part of the clearing that I need to do in it, is, to find ways of thinking about free speech. Because I think one of the problems, or let's say it's a kind of ambiguous problem when it comes to thinking about free speech, is that, we often talk about it in the abstract. We talk about the principle, we talk about the normative idea. And then when something happens, when there's a conflict or an antagonism that seems to be about freedom of speech, it very quickly becomes a debate about the principle, and we might lose what's going on in the concrete conflict or antagonism. So it can be both an abstraction and a bit of kind of a sacred object. So when you start to think critically about what free speech means, you immediately run the risk of being seen or being painted as being kind of anti-free speech, which happens quite a bit. So let me say at the start, I have a lot of sympathy for the way in which people just sort of, all of us in many ways, orient ourselves to the idea that, free speech is important and free speech is good. Of course it is. We wouldn't be doing something like this if we didn't have that kind of orientation. When we think about our personhood, our social being, we have that orientation in very basic and very valuable ways. So it's a good orientation. But I think the problem is the kind of political abstraction of freedom of speech prevents us thinking about a number of things, not just what forms of freedom we're talking about, but also I think a question which is considered far less, which is, what do we mean by speech? When we're talking about communication, what are we seeking to valorize, and what does it do in the world, and how do we understand that? So one of the things is that if we think about sort of Western capitalist states, liberal and social democracies, it's broadly the liberal tradition that provides the kind of touchstone vocabulary, the kind of ideas that people come back to and that circulate constantly in public debate for thinking about freedom of speech. But when we dig down into that tradition, actually, one of the things that we see is that freedom of speech doesn't mean just one thing. Very, very quickly, we see very little of the kind of cartoonish absolutism that you see as a kind of position in contemporary political and media debates. So we could say that freedom of speech, if it means one thing, it means, I suppose, a kind of a presumption of as much liberty as can be mustered for speech. And within the broadly liberal tradition, that means speech within legitimate constraints. And again, this is often left out of the picture that, when you think about capitalist property relations such as copyright, that's regarded as a legitimate restraint. When we think of legal processes, perjury or criminal solicitation, these are regarded, within these polities as legitimate restraints. The right to privacy and a good name, so in terms of laws on slander and libel, the same. So the notion of liberty for speech is already made possible by the kinds of institutionalized, legal, invisibilized restraints, if you like, which are placed on forms of speech. And so when we kind of start to drill down, if you like, into this sort of broadly speaking liberal tradition, we start to find differentiated understandings of what free speech means very, very, very quickly. So, speech is not just about speaking, obviously. If we think of controversies over symbolic gestures such as taking the knee or, obviously very differently, Nazi salutes in public, these are recurrent free speech controversies which are non-verbal. And the freedom to speak is not the same as free speech. In other words, free speech requires a kind of dimension of publicity, the intent to communicate propositions to an audience. And that's what begins to forge the link to questions of democratic life and procedure very, very quickly. And it's also, of course, then what connects freedom of speech to other closely related notions: freedom of the press, assembly, freedom of association. So in other words, a class of acts which are understood together. So that would be one way of saying that even within the tradition of which we mainly speak about freedom of speech, differentiations and complications start to become apparent very quickly. Of course, if we approach it from outside of that tradition, which I do largely, then we can complicate it and differentiate it much further. And I'll just say a couple of things briefly about that, because I know that we'll come back to these as we go along. I think the first thing, and because I do work in a media studies department and research communications, one of the problems with the idea of freedom of speech as just one thing is it makes speech into just one thing. And speech or communication is simply not one unitary thing. And we don't experience communication in this way. And we don't experience it. I think what's important about that is we don't experience it as something which is simply free or unfree. So if you think a lot of the times around the way freedom of speech is spoken about, and something happens and people argue, well, look, if there's going to be a restraint there, that's the slippery slope. Where are we going to end up? We need to protect freedom of speech before it becomes unfree. But in fact, I think if we think kind of realistically about our relationship to speech and communication, just even first of all in the everyday world, what we exist within are relations of freedom and unfreedom, constraint and possibility. flexibility, restraint and coercion, as well as kind of contingent openings. So, in the relationships we have with others, the way that we speak and the way that we practice freedom of speech are constrained in all kinds of reflexive but also often coercive ways. When we're within institutions, for example, when any of us are teaching a class, the way that speech is organized in that class and distributed in that class is not free because of the weight of institutional practice and the sort of power relation between teacher and students. In the workplace, in a whole range of ways, what people say is, in some cases scripted, but it's also something which is heavily, I suppose, kind of bordered by the kinds of costs which are involved in speaking freely, potentially. Everything from whistleblowers to just the way in which one can become a subject of bullying in the workplace for speaking out of turn or for being a union representative or whatever it might be. So we've got all of these forms of closure that we live with, and we've also got kind of forms of what you could call foreclosure. So if you live or migrate to a country where you don't speak the language, and then you suddenly have to start negotiating the labor market and negotiating institutions as you learn that language, you're not speaking freely in that language. You are foreclosed through those kinds of social, political terms as well. And so all of this, if you like, this kind of more realist map of constraints and possibilities that I'm talking about is then, of course, mediated by your position in the social hierarchy in all kinds of ways. Who listens, who sees you as worth hearing or not. So what I suppose one of the things I try to lay out in the book is that speech is a far more complex terrain. It's organized and distributed in lots of ways in all of our lives. And so yes, there is coercion, but there's also restriction and limitation in all of these kinds of shifting ways. And I think that, if we break it down that way, we could also connect it out. And this is the last point I'll make on this one, which is that we very rarely then stop to relate freedom of speech to other freedoms, or better still, to wider questions of oppression and emancipation. And if we do that, we can see that huge amounts of people do not enjoy freedom of speech at all as a consequence of other forms of incarceration, but they rarely appear to us as freedom of speech issues. So be it incarceration, political repression, social marginalization, any kind of meaningful access to a public space or access to or control over forms of communication, and so forth. So I think, these differences have always been there, and they're already quite marked in different sort of philosophical and political traditions. But I think what is happening nowadays is that presuppositions and ideas about what speech is and how free or unfree it is are in collision much more intensively with each other in the kind of digital public space, if you like.
I was just going to point out that I've been in the American Civil Liberties Union. I've been on the boards there for a while, and we get into these debates about free speech and stuff. And I know for a lot of people, they have to explain about the limitations on the First Amendment that, we have to accept when it comes to like protest and like volume and place and things like that. And what's so funny is the arguments I've gotten into with fellow Americans and other people in the ACLU and other places where they'll be like, free speech, but I'm like, well, technically in America we have no free speech, but, asterisk. It's like to kind of make the distinction between what rights you do and do not have and what exceptions that we of course accept under the First Amendment versus absolute free speech. And a lot of people tend to vacillate between First Amendment and absolute free speech arguments, not knowing or, unconsciously. And they tend to lean really hard on speech being completely absolute. And I think that's really hurt a lot of this argument. And I see some people jump into that. What political purposes do contemporary calls for free speech serve in light of these kind of things and what you're saying?
Yeah, it's a really good point you make. And there's obviously a really, really complex and interesting history around the ACLU and these debates. And I think, just to add one last kind of bridging point, I think that's important as well when you talk about, the First Amendment, not just in kind of its legal scope and, the fact that the sort of many of the restrictions which are involved are also less debated, but also it's a kind of a cultural sign which guides debates about how people think about free speech and how they orient themselves to it. And you have versions of that also in different sort of cultural, political territories, so there are also kind of cultural ways in which the debate around freedom of speech is posed, I suppose, which are different, while also being very, very transnational. So the First Amendment will be made reference to all over the place in terms of how these debates have taken shape over the last few years. And maybe one way into that is exactly the question you ask, which is what do political purposes do these kind of contemporary calls serve? And it's, I suppose, one of my motivations in writing the book or in thinking about this, and it wasn't maybe the central motivation because I'm not very wedded, as you can tell, to the freedom of speech as a kind of notion in the way that it's hegemonically talked about. But it is a problem that it's sort of not just trivialized, but kind of ideologically instrumentalized in the ways that it is so successfully instrumentalized, I suppose. And so kind of starkly done by the same kinds of performers and the same kind of political operators or political entrepreneurs and the same kinds of spectacles, which are shaped across a lot of different contexts around us at the moment. So I think it's an important question, and I think it's an important question as well for one of the things we may get into, which is the call, which is very understandable on, broadly speaking, the political left to take back free speech, which I agree with this at a sort of kind of emotive political level. But I don't think it's so simple, either intellectually or politically, until we have worked through why forms of appropriation have been so successful, particularly on the political right and the far right, and then this wider sort of political instrumentalization we're talking about. So we might get into some of that kind of stuff, a bit of a more general answer first. I think the main purpose of it is to create political space. And the reason why I attach it in my argument, and I think, we attach it in terms of this discussion to particular kinds of politics, is that it's a very good way of creating political space for attempting to legitimate or reanimate sort of reactionary ideas, and particularly, as we'll get into later on, around race and around kind of histories of racial science and racial thought. So on the one hand, there's this kind of political reflex, but that political reflex can't be understood, I think, without the idea that it's also about commanding attention in a media space where communication, opinions, hot takes circulate at speed in irrational abundance, right? It's impossible for any of us to keep up with, one hashtag, never mind the totality of debates on any kind of issue. So lots of actors, lots of opinions, lots of fragmentation. So we all know the cliche maybe of the high-profile columnist who's been silenced across their many syndicated columns and media appearances, and it's absurd as a performance. But the hypocrisy doesn't matter too much, because what this does is it attracts sufficient attention. It's a way of engaging and mobilizing already quite partisan audiences. It's a way of generating content through, reaction, all of these things that we know. But I think there's also maybe a sense that there's a kind of a moral payoff from claiming freedom of speech in these ways. To be clear, freedom of speech where people are claiming that their freedom of speech is endangered or that they are being silenced when there is simply no material or political evidence of any kind, of coercion of any kind. It's simply about creating space and deflecting criticism. So within that, I think there's a couple of things which are useful for thinking about later on. The first is that I think it produces a certain kind of public positionality, which is not just that I am being silenced, so this is about my rights and my autonomy, but what I have to say is being unfairly and irrationally marginalized or silenced or dismissed without being engaged with. So in other words, the taboo breaking things that I have to say, the unpopular truths that I need to tell you, are being silenced because my opponents can't deal with them. My opponents don't want to debate them. And what you find in that is a kind of an echo of the way that in, someone like John Stuart Mill, when he looks at the value of kind of heterodox ideas and minority voices, he proposes that these must be especially cherished because they have a particular consequentialist value. In other words, they test the truth, they can contribute to knowledge through the fact of the odd ideas that they might throw up that we need to deal with. They contribute overall to the kind of democratic value of freedom of speech. So what a lot of actors are trying to claim is a version of that sort of heterodox status, that what I have to say, even if it may be the same reactionary talking points about migrants or about trans people or whoever it is this week, even if we know and can predict what that content is in advance, what they're doing is presenting ideas that have a clear history, discourses that go around and around and around with some kind of deliberative or democratic value. They're saying, why aren't you debating me? You won't debate me. Can we not deal with the ideas rather than deal with the ad hominems and so forth? So in the book, I try to look at that as a kind of a labor relation, if you like, a kind of political labor relation of the digital age. And let's talk here about racism, for example, where, people are subject to racism. And one of the things that happens is that every sort of racialized proposition or artifact that can be dredged up from the internet is then sort of put forward as if this is an idea that doesn't have a history and that history doesn't define it, and that idea hasn't been, marginalized or discredited through not just intellectual work, but through sort of political mobilization and political opposition. What happens is that then these ideas are treated as if the sun rises for the first time every day, and ideas don't have a history, it's nothing but speech, and therefore you must engage with it. Why won't you engage with another debate about race and intelligence? Why won't you engage with another debate about black fathers? Why won't you engage with another debate about what the Quran says? This kind of thing. And I think that that's one of its sort of main purposes in the way that it increases the sort of inequalities of who can contribute on top of the material inequalities. It increases the inequalities as to who can contribute in public and in what ways. And what it also does is it detracts any kind of discussion from the way in which this is not just speech. This is speech as a form of political act, but this is also speech as content creation. I think that one of the things that's happening in digital publics is that the sheer machinic production of speech and then the sort of machinic production of kind of reactionary speech is putting huge pressure on this sort of heritage of consequentialist or deliberative heritage of thinking about how ideas circulate in public. It's simply not possible for people to keep up with the demands for a debate. And we all know, if we've spent any time on Twitter, exactly how that works out as a kind of coercion, as a way of wasting people's time. And racism, as Toni Morrison put it, is also very often about wasting people's time.
You discussed in your book how conflicting definitions of racism are expressed in the so-called free speech debate. Can you explain that?
Yeah, I mean, I suppose this is at the heart of the book in some ways, in that, I didn't set out to write a book which is squarely about freedom of speech, because there's just an enormous literature on that, though, I have become more interested in some of these debates subsequently. But I wanted to try to look at this particular intersection with questions of race and racism, or let's say more specifically, the kind of politics of mobilizing around sort of naming and opposing racism in the societies that I mainly look at, which is partly the United States, much more the UK, France, the Nordic countries, that kind of thing. And so what I try to set out is maybe a little complex to summarize, but I'll try to summarize it. If you think about a lot of the ways in which sort of racism and freedom of speech debates intersect, they intersect in a particular kind of way. In a lot of the academic literature, the debate is very much about racist speech and when racist speech becomes hate speech. And therefore, when does it become something which is, a particular class of act, that it discriminates, that it humiliates, or that it can be an incitement to violence or whatever it might be. And therefore, the question becomes about, what are the kinds of limits that should be placed on racist speech and how is that defined and who gets to define it and all of these kinds of debates. I'm kind of looking at something different, which is to try to trace the ways in which anti-racism has become regarded as a prime form of censorship, of, if you like, restricting the freedom to speak. And again, this has got a lot to do with the kind of grifting that I was talking about in the last question, but it has slightly more profound roots. And I think one of the ways that I try to explain that is to think about the notion of kind of post-racialism, which again is a highly footnoted term and a very controversial one for good reasons. But in the book, I look at the notion of post-racialism as the assumption that societies, polities, institutions are opposed to racism and recognize it as an evil, and societies and institutions are kind of officially anti-racist. However, the racism that is in question is defined in very particular terms and understood in very kind of particular terms. And a key to that is understanding it as racism, which is something which is largely overcome, which is largely, if you like, defined by its pasts. And so the kind of political extremism or ignorant attitudes that people might express are sort of hangovers from the past. And therefore, it should be possible to reach a kind of an agreement on what racism means, and therefore to decide this is racism and that this is not racism, and what is racism gets sort of condemned and dealt with, and what is not racism is everything else. That's open debate. And so what's sort of hegemonically considered as racism is, as Alana Lenton, my friend, has argued in her recent book, tends to sort of focus on some very, very sort of particular kind of ideas. One is that racism must be understood in primarily sort of biological or pseudoscientific terms, so very much sort of derived from thinking about the Holocaust most obviously, but also thinking about the sort of the high moment of racial science from the late 19th century through to the Second World War. And that then racism is something which is a question of ideas, of aberrant ideas, that people believe in the wrong kind of ideas. And then that thirdly, racism is also something that cuts every which way. It's sort of prejudice on the basis of appearance or skin color that everybody can practice against everybody else. And of course, what this, hegemonic anti-racism, let's call it as a shorthand, what this does is it clashes with the way in which anti-colonial, anti-racist movements have always understood racism, which is as something historical, as something which is constantly changing. As Sivanandan put it very nicely, and as I quote in the book, racism doesn't stay still. It's constantly changing according to changes in the economy. So we can think about the different ways, for example, in which, migrant populations become racialized over time. But also it changes because of the ways in which it is opposed and the ways in which people sort of struggle against it. So racism is understood as something historical. But maybe here you can kind of see where the problem starts to come in. That if you're trying to describe those historical changes, let's say you're trying to describe Islamophobia as a form of racism, for example, or trying to describe the way in which, EU border violence racializes certain people as a problem population of refugees and migrants that need to be dealt with, you're not adhering to the agreed definition of racism that everybody is against because all reasonable people are against racism. What you're doing, and this is the way that the argument goes, and you can see this constantly playing out, you can see it playing out in some of the responses to Black Lives Matter, you can see it constantly in response to somebody trying to talk about, particularly people of color, trying to talk about the racialized dimensions of everyday interactions or the racialized dimensions of institutional discrimination or whatever it might be. It's only legitimate to do that if you can show that it is racism or not racism. And when you're trying to describe something which is more motile, something which is more about how different sorts of social forces and political aspects intersect with each other, that's not just racism or not racism, then what happens is you become the one that's bringing race into everything. You're the one that's shutting down open debate by bringing race into it. You're the one that is restricting speech by calling certain things racist. So in other words, that heavy historical weight of racism, it's argued, is being sort of wielded to shut down open debate. And that's the kind of political space that I'm interested in. I think that that's a kind of very structural political conflict. But when we start to think about, for example, the far right, we'll see how some people are or the so-called, dark enlightenment, we'll see how some people are very, very good at navigating the possibilities of that kind of space.
Yeah, I've noticed that the inability actually to deal with structural racism by critics of Black Lives Matter has actually been really good. It's like the kryptonite of the far right and white supremacists. They literally, I've been watching all these YouTube videos, Charlie Kirk and all these other people, the grifters, and people getting dark money from all these white supremacist think tanks and PragerU. They literally are at loss to debunk structural racism, and they have to fall back on that definition of, racism is only, interpersonal animus, it's individualized, and therefore they could throw it back on, therefore you could be racist against white people. I've been watching how that goes. Ani?
How does this context of pluralized media or communicative abundance, as you put it in the book, how does that shape this contention over free speech and racism?
I think it has a lot to do with it. There are so many continuities, of course, for a start. So I just want to point out as well that what I'm talking about here, this notion of anti-racism as something kind of that has gone too far, and reasonable people agree that racism is bad, but, anti-racism has gone too far, anti-fascism has gone too far. The kind of two sides, two extremists that a sort of centrist sensibility likes to produce. This is something which has been around for quite a long time. And also the idea that talking about racism shuts down debate has been around for quite a long time. So, the so-called new right in Europe was very, very good at sort of attempting to regenerate a racializing politics around sort of culture and everyday life and the nation as our home by sort of pointing to, it's not really the sort of racialized migrants' fault, but it's all of the kind of the multiculturalists and the race relations busybodies, as they used to be called in Britain, who keep bringing race into it, and ordinary people feel that they can't talk about ordinary problems that they encounter as their country changes around them. So there's a kind of the long genealogy to some of these kinds of ways of turning anti-racism into the problem and using that as a way of sort of stymieing a confrontation with the ways in which racism sort of is given different political, economic and social expression. And, I was reading recently, it's an interesting one from the kind of US point of view, Nicholas Bukala's book, The Fire is Upon Us, which was the history of the debate between James Baldwin and William F. Buckley in Cambridge in 1965. And that's the same year as the Selma to Montgomery March. And, this is a year of kind of gleeful state violence and repression, but also resistance. But Buckley, who many of your listeners will know is the founder of the National Review, published an essay in that year called Are You Racist? And what he argued in that, you could take this argument and you could transplant it into so many of the kinds of, kind of blogs and YouTube interventions that we're talking about here. He says, racism is bad, but the word racist is used indiscriminately, he says. Its meaning is kind of diluted. Everything's been made into a question of racism. And this prevents us focusing on real racism. And real racism for him is Hitler. But the real problem, Buckley argues, is that innocent people are being denounced. Innocent people are being silenced for simply trying to tell the truth as they see it. So what he's saying is that even in the midst of the civil rights struggle, 3 years before the assassination of Martin Luther King, the problem is anti-racism is already too censorious. It's too indiscriminate. it. It's too uncompromising. It's already gone too far. It's bringing race into everything. This is the kind of the playbook, or what we'd now call the playbook, because a lot of these ideas have sort of calcified. They've been sort of boiled down into tweet-sized arguments that lots of people can reproduce. When we're looking at someone like Berkeley, or when we're looking at the New Right, we're looking at very sort of conscious ideological projects, which are about trying to not just reassert hierarchy and privilege, but also very much trying to find ways of disguising hierarchy and privilege. And that's why this sort of reverse victimhood is so important to those ideological projects. But when we start to look now in terms of the impact of whatever we might want to call the public space or public culture, which has been changed and shaped in so many ways by the nature of kind of digital media platforms, particularly social media platforms, I think one of the most important aspects of it for me in terms of thinking about questions of sort of racism and anti-racism is that the silencing, which is often associated with post-racialism, is also something now which is achieved through noise. So I'll try to explain what I mean by that. And I argue it a little bit in the book, and I look at it in more detail in a book you mentioned at the start, Racism and Media, which I wrote in published in 2019. So in other words, one of the things which sort of characterizes thinking about racism under these terms that I've been looking at, that it's something which is, about ideas and ideologies and particular kinds of acts, is that the sort of the living legacies and the reconstitutions of racial relations, particularly under neoliberalism, become very, very difficult to name as racism or name as something which were sort of racialized social relations. And so, a lot of literature which has looked at this, particularly in the United States, or, over the 80s and 90s, talked about the kind of silencing or muting of racism. So sort of racial dimensions are present, yet it's very, very difficult to name it as racism when racism now means this kind of intentional form, an ideational form or ideological form of action. I think what the sort of the cacophony and the speed and the abundance of the digital media public sphere or public space does is it adds a dimension of noise to that, which is that when anybody wants to talk about or try to analyze or try to bring to some kind of public attention or invest in the idea that public attention has political value by talking about racism in public, immediately what happens to them is, as I argue, that claim becomes debatable, not debated in a way that we associate with the kind of, liberal free speech heritage of debate, some kind of understanding or resolution, but simply it just becomes a subject of debate, and it goes around and around and it goes around and around, subject to, the same kind of contrarian opinions, subject to false kinds of balance, subject to, forms of questioning which become sort of often deeply intrusive and deeply troubling. And therefore, to talk about racism becomes subject to a kind of test as to whether this is really racism or not. And I think that that's what I term a kind of a noise, that there's always any kind of claim can be turned into a focus of debate, but that debate is made up of ideas and responses and actions which are very predictable, and as I said before, have these kind of long discursive histories. And so it becomes very sort of difficult to talk about or mobilize around any kind of understanding of racism under these kinds of conditions, because it's just constantly subject to this sort of reflex of, well, we're all against racism, but are you sure this is real racism? Are you sure that this isn't something else? And I think it's constant intensification and constant sort of vulnerability people have to that sort of intensification of debatability that I try to look at.
That's fascinating. I did not realize the roots in that argument in Berkeley. Here you have a white supremacist supporter of South African apartheid trying to argue that, oh yes, racism is a problem, but we have to see proper racism. And we've seen that become here in America that it's a worse crime to call somebody a racist than for somebody to be a racist.
Yeah, and absolutely that's where, as I said, there clearly are very sort of important ideological projects that we can map out here and analyze, which are about attempting to reestablish racializing ideas and sensibilities and racialized hierarchies and inequalities, but while marking their distance from, the sign of bad racism. And one of the ways to do that, of course, is to amplify this notion of an equivalence, that actually all good people are kind of against racism. Maybe that person misspoke, but then they were hopped on by the anti-racists that want to shut down voices and stop us from talking about certain kinds of ideas and so forth, as if that's possible under the kind of communicative conditions that we're talking about.
Yeah, it just basically sounds like high-level gaslighting at that level. And it makes sense, because, people in a position of power can, of course, gaslight everyone else who accurately points out, hey, you're being racist, sexist, homophobic, transphobic to me. And they can say, nuh-uh. But how have the far right captured the concept of free speech?
When I wrote the book, I mean, I was obviously thinking a lot about this. I started thinking about it around the time of, the very high-profile campus conflicts in the US, among other sort of obvious ways in which the far right were attracted to a particular way of thinking about and presenting themselves in relation to debates about free speech and the values that are attached to free speech. But when I wrote the book, I deliberately deal with this at the very end, in the last chapter. So I have kind of 3 chapters. Closure, which is the kind of what I've been describing here in terms of this sort of post-racial structural problem between, attempting to think about racism as something political and historical and contextual, and then the notion of racism as something that good societies are against but frozen in time in terms of our understanding. So I talk about that in terms of this notion of closure, and then something that we might come to later on, I look at the kind of culturalization of freedom of speech, which is, something which intensified in all kinds of ways in the sort of post 9/11 war on terror period, where freedom of speech gets centered as a marker of, national or European or Western sort of civilizational value that problem populations need to prove that they respect. And I'll come back to that in a little while. But one of the reasons I made these arguments first is because I don't think we can understand the success of the far right unless we understand these other kinds of dimensions of the problem, or the way that these kind of overlapping but quite different things intersect with each other, and the kinds of opportunity structures that they present for the far right. So I think that there's a couple of things I could say. There's a lot we could say about how the far right has captured the idea of freedom of speech, but let me just say 2 things. And this is also something which I think shows us the slightly different kind of political, cultural geographies that are at play. I think in the United States, this sort of campus tours and the very deliberate and well-planned attempt to create spectacles.
Yeah, it seems to be coming out of the think tanks.
Yeah, I think that's the first thing. And I think it's very, very important, especially with that undercurrent of the discussion, how does the left reclaim freedom of speech? I think the first thing that's very, very important to do is to constantly make the political economy of this kind of free speech spectacle manifest. So, who is paying for these speakers? Where does that money come from? There's a lot of good people who do that kind of work constantly. I can, provide some references on it for the program notes or whatever. What that allows us to show is that, the very same sort of networks which are interested in creating space for far right or far right adjacent speakers on campuses are also, of course, involved in targeting academics for harassment, getting them fired by trawling through their tweets and finding something that can be, presented as, anti-white racism or whatever it might be, and just attempting to wreck their lives. So there's a very sort of organized set of political groups. There's an economy that is around this form of intervention, which is very, very important to make manifest. But I think the spectacle kind of works also because of weaknesses in some of the dominant understandings of freedom of speech. So, let's be clear, what the far right want from campus speaking tours is they want spectacle. And spectacle is ambivalent. It can work out for them in a number of which ways. One is that they get to go on campus and they get a platform, and they get a platform which has the imprimatur in one way or another of a university. They also get the publicity that comes with protests. And if they are prevented from speaking, or whether simply, the university decides this is not worth the insurance risk, then they become victims whose freedom of speech has been taken away. So it's about spectacle. And it's very, what they play on here, to be a little theoretical for a moment, is they play on, a very clever distinction in terms of thinking about communication that, for example, James Carey has made in relation to thinking about the history of communication studies in the US. He contrasts what he calls the transmission model of communication, which is, what we're doing here. We're communicating ideas to each other. So we transmit things. It's like taking ideas from A to B. Very, very kind of commonsensical ways of thinking about how communication functions. The idea is I speak to transfer something to somebody else's brain or their understanding. It's the transmission of information. But of course, communication doesn't just do that. It also has sort of ritual aspects. So, if somebody goes to a religious ceremony, what's being said is not news to them, right? There's no transmission value as such. They know the liturgy, but it's about the ritual. It's about the communality. It's about being in space together in particular ways. So what the far right is essentially interested in is ritual. It's interested in knowing that these kinds of interventions will play out in particular sorts of ways. But it presents itself as only being interested in transmission. In other words, we're not racists, but we really just want to talk about who the real victims in all of this are, or whatever the sort of talking point of the week is. So they present themselves as only being about transmission. But politically, their logic and rationale is all about ritual. So they win either which way. And somebody called John Durham Peters, who's a really interesting philosopher of communication, has a very good book called Courting the Abyss, which is about, thinking about freedom of speech in the liberal tradition. And one of the points that he makes is that, what happens in these sort of spectacles or in these set pieces is very particular. There's a kind of triangulation, and he describes it almost like a kind of morality play, that the transgressor who wants to speak a kind of transgressive truth will speak, and then they may run into some kind of trouble. They may be, deplatformed, they may be sued, whatever it might be. And obviously also people who are subject to this particular kind of, racialized or discriminatory truth will object to it. They will protest. And then what happens is that the third point of the triangle is the kind of liberal enabler, if you like, who says, well, I understand why you're upset and why you're offended, but there's no right to be offended. And so what's really important here are the speech rights of the transgressor. And so what happens in this triangular structure is immediately the democratic problem becomes the protesters, those who are insufficiently committed to democracy, or who are insufficiently committed to civility, or insufficiently able to deal with the robustness of democratic debate, whereby everybody's expected to take offense. And so it's a very, very, very sort of productive structure, because there's always enough people, and powerful people, journalists, university rectors, others, who will walk in and play that third point in the triangle, and who will dredge up a quote from a US Supreme Court justice, or, things that Voltaire never said, and say, that what we do by listening to these arguments is that we strengthen democracy for everybody. And of course, what is inadmissible to that way of thinking about civil society and way of thinking about democracy is the distribution of cost and the distribution of harm and the distribution of risk when you bring political actors who are geared towards, political organization, claiming space and claiming legitimacy, and not to having a particular debate with you. So I think, that triangulation is really, really important for understanding what happens within these sort of university set pieces. They're slightly different when we start to think about the far right and media, for example. And here again, I think one of the problems with the undifferentiated idea of freedom of speech, which is what we started with, is there isn't enough thought often in these public debates about, well, what is it about universities that is particular in terms of how speech is organized? Academic freedom is not exactly the same as freedom of speech, and very often they're in tension with each other. Editorial policies and practices govern the way in which people come to speak or be allowed to speak, and what they speak about, and the framework that they're given to speak when they're in a broadcast or media situation of a certain kind. How freedom of speech works is also quite different there. But what the far right is very, very good at capturing is precisely what we started with, this undifferentiated, well-meaning orientation toward freedom of speech as a kind of undifferentiated moral good. And so lastly, I think, but also what we need to add to that picture is that one of the reasons why the far right in Europe has got similar sort of attraction to freedom of speech, but it doesn't work out as well for them under those terms. But the more recent attraction to freedom of speech is because they adopt it as a mode of civilizational politics. So, it's a long story, but shortly rendered. One of the things that the war on terror did was gifted, precisely because of the sort of kind of racist, integrationist policies of the parliamentary right and centre right, and in some cases the centre left. They gifted the far right a whole new vocabulary of looking at sort of problem populations of unintegrated and unintegratable Muslims, or unknown and dangerous migrants who don't share our way of life, but where our way of life is not defined so much anymore in terms of the ethno-state, a culture that we all share, but our way of life is something which is defined by shared values, British values, French values, European values, whatever it might be, where there's always a population that have to prove their capacities and their willingness to live by those values. And in doing that, and in centering freedom of speech, which again, there's a long history here with the controversies in Denmark over the Jyllands Posten cartoons, the Charlie Hebdo tragedy, which you mentioned at the start that I'd written about. So there's a lot of things which sort of prompted this politics. But what it did was it gifted, especially sort of non-traditional, new forms of kind of far-right street movements that were looking for ways of kind of mobilizing around, who the problem population is, but also marking their distance from who the real Nazis are. We're not racist. The real Nazis are not us. We've got a politics which is just concerned with, can people walk the street safely at night? Can people express themselves? Can gay people be free to be gay? Can we have gender equality in our society anymore? That kind of whole politics was gifted in the 2000s to the far right, and it allowed them to take up freedom of speech in ways which have actually been quite interesting. I mean, there have been freedom of speech marches across Europe over the last years, which are about defending freedom of speech from the Muslims that don't respect it. And what happened subsequently is that many of those movements and many of those marches, of course, also became about where's our freedom of speech once Twitter or YouTube or wherever it is has kicked us off and finally decided to close down our accounts. So, that sort of politics of mobilizing around freedom of speech in parts of the European far right has a very, very important relationship with centrist politics.
I've noticed I've had to make Karl Popper's argument of tolerance of intolerance paradox to those people who are that third prong of the triangulation there, the well-meaning liberals or whatever who argue, oh, you have no right to be offended, and all these things that end up centering the bigots and the racists and stuff in their right to say these things. And I also feel like exactly what you're saying with how the war on terror has affected free speech and who's the guardians of free speech. It's almost like Zack Snyder's movie The 300 is like the apotheosis of that whole idea of the West is protecting all these ideas of the Enlightenment and free speech and everything from the evil East and Muslims. So I'd like to ask, how is the legal right to free speech distinct from the way it's used in racist discourse today?
Yeah, I mean, it's very distinct. I mean, just on what you were saying there as well, I mean, I completely agree with it, but I think it's important not to give the impression from my side that I think that no platforming and tactics of disruption are straightforward either. I think that these are tactics and strategies which have to be looked at in a given situation and in a given context and in a given antagonism, of course. But I think one of the things that really irks me and frustrated me, and I wanted to bring across in the book, is that these debates, you know, about sort of platforming the far right are often presented as that one point of the triangle has all of the kind of normative ideas and commitments to freedom and emancipation and dialogue on their side, and those who, you know, those who advocate, for example, no platforming, are simply looking to shut things down. And what that misses is that something like no platforming as a tactic and strategy has generated within movements an enormously rich collective knowledge in terms of thinking about tactics, thinking about how to differentiate between different parts of the far right, thinking about different kinds of consequences according to the context, thinking about the public reception of different sorts of political acts. Huge amount of work, normative, political, ethical, strategic work has gone into that as well. And I think that just gets left out in the way that that triangle operates. On the question of the legal distinction, I mean, I'm not a lawyer, as everyone might have guessed by now. And one of the things that I wanted to do in the book was to make a kind of a modest plea for understanding that the way in which we think about freedom of speech and the way that we act in relation to it has as much to do with kind of making publics. It has as much to do with sort of carving out forms of legitimate speech and legitimate being in very sort of busy, complex and antagonistic publics as it has to do with legal restraint. But one of the problems in the literature of freedom of speech is the sort of the legal horizon becomes the only horizon because it becomes the threshold of permissibility. So what I was trying to argue is that there's a lot of things that we need to orient ourselves to and think about in terms of freedom of speech that don't necessarily, and in fact very often don't involve the law. So think there, for example, around editorial policy as to, you know, whether the far right gets to speak or under what terms they're reported, all of that kind of thing. So there's a huge distinction between the way in which the law and different sort of branches of the law and different areas of the law, as I set this out at the start in terms of talking about, you know, intellectual property rights, privacy, slander, all of these kinds of things. Different ways in which the law sort of not just, I suppose if I wanted to make one point here, it would be this, not just different ways in which the law organizes speech, but different ways in which the law depends on communication theory, different ways in which the law, if you like, assumes different understandings of communication. So let me just give a very brief example of what I mean without going into too much detail about it. If you look in the sort of post-war period in Europe and sort of post-war Western European settlement with the Nazi past, many countries banned public display of Nazi and fascist memorabilia. And they did so, in so doing, they were banning forms of speech. You know, so for example, banning the Nazi salute. But if you look across jurisdictions, the sort of logic of that ban depended on interpreting that gesture as a sign, as an act of communication in very different ways, ranging from, you know, the idea that the salute in and of itself was essentially a political assault on the constitutional settlement of the state, to the notion of the salute being an attempt to proselytize, an attempt to, you know, mobilize others, to then ways of, you know, even kind of more complex legal cases which emerged where, you know, people who gave the Nazi sign in public, I'm not going to say where because I know that I've got the jurisprudence a little mixed in my mind, so I'll try to give a kind of general summary, but where if you could prove that you were giving the Nazi salute as an expression of your conscience and not attempting to proselytize or mobilize others, then it was protected under freedom of speech. But if it was a political gesture attempting to get others to do something, then it became a different class of act. So the point I'm trying to make here is that even something like a salute, everybody who does it raises their arm. There's a sort of physical basis to the gesture which produces the sign, but the way in which law encodes it as a sign that has particular meanings, and then as a sign which which is connected to particular forms of action or potential action is very, very different. So the legal organization of speech is not just about restrictions, it's also about communication theory. And that's something that I've been trying to bring a little bit back into the discussions. Now, to answer the question about the way that it's different in terms of racist discourse, I think one of the things which is most successful about the way in which, let's say, the far right or particular, kinds of racist grifters talk about freedom of speech is that the freedom that they're talking about, but they leave this unarticulated, is a freedom which is simply, a freedom from any kind of constraint that you think is arbitrary or that is being imposed on you by people that you already dislike. It's a very effective invitation to just say, screw you. I don't care about your speech codes. You're not going to make me think things that I don't want to think. You're not going to take my country away from me by making me think these things that I don't want to think. So in other words, it's an invitation to understand freedom as sort of the absence of restraint, and included in those restraints is, of course, counter-argument. I mean, this is one of the things where there's a real kind of irony about the way in which that liberal point of the triangle cedes the notion of freedom of speech to reactionary actors, which is what they're doing is they're using the claim to freedom of speech to suggest that any form of protest, any form of counter-argument, any form of pushback is in and of itself an arbitrary form of restriction on their freedom of speech. Whereas, of course, the entire basis of the kind of liberal consequentialist way of thinking about the value of speech is that it is counter-speech, which will, sort out the best ideas from the worst ideas. It is counter-speech, which will allow, people to democratically decide which ideas a society values and which it doesn't, and so on and so forth. I take this a little bit from Wendy Brown in her last book, who I think was very interesting about the way in which you kind of theorize that notion of freedom as something which has also been produced over a longer period of time by the kind of denigration of the social and the political by, kind of neoliberal forms of governmentality. That if it is only about me, then why on earth should I be beholden to these things that I simply don't value? So freedom of speech becomes a particular kind of invitation to celebrate the ego, if you like.
It's a very interesting way of putting it, and that's kind of like having to do with positive and negative liberty with the state, because we have no hate crime laws in the United States. I mean, hate speech. We have hate crime extensions upon when people are being sentenced, but we don't have hate speech laws like Canada and other places or Germany.
Yeah, and they are ambivalent. I mean, there's a whole other discussion to be had about how effective the category of hate speech is and everything. Yeah, it's true.
Yeah, I'm not exactly for them, especially how they could be wielded by the state. But, it makes sense in Germany, and the way you explained it there, the distinctions they made, that kind of seems like the best compromise you could make. But it's the way I look at no platforming Nazis is like, well, you're stopping someone from organizing a pogrom, a lynching, or the creation of a ethno-state and a genocide by organizing people in street mobs and stuff, rather than, you're not just stopping somebody from saying blah, blah, blah. And I think people have a hard time with that one. And I think the right was really able to get to liberals and really get to the colleges this idea that, how pernicious and how censorious non-platforming was. Ignoring for a moment the racist appropriation of the concept, do you think there are genuine state threats to free speech in contemporary societies?
Absolutely. And I think that that's also one of the things that I do look at in certain ways in the book, which is to not quite bluntly suggest that this sort of, this constant appropriation and cheapening of freedom of speech blinds us to genuine threats, but rather something else, which is that if we accept the slightly more kind of pessimist or realist way that I set out the kind of terrain of speech and communication at the start, then what we're aware of is that there are constant forms of not just what I was talking about, sort of restriction and closure, but also coercion. But the question for me in the book is what forms of coercion or potential coercion can lay claim to recognition as a free speech issue and which can't. In other words, so what can mobilize this sort of free speech and crisis framework and what can't? And so one of the things that I look at in relation to that is exactly this kind of war on terror period and this sort of two-track approach to freedom of speech by those states which beat the drums and beat the chest about their democratic status quite a bit. And so, of course, one of the things which we know quite a lot about during this period is the ways in which Security Act, from the Patriot Act to the Prevent agenda in the UK to, security laws in Australia to, security laws brought in after the Charlie Hebdo attacks in France, or reactivated rather after the attacks in 2015, that all of these acts have been sort of catastrophic for political speech, as free speech. To broadly summarize across them, what they end up doing is again redefining forms of speech, political speech, as forms of speech that sort of can't aspire to be free because they've already been redefined as a different kind of act, as something other than speech. So, as evidence of radicalization, or giving succor to terrorism, or as justifying terrorism or justifying violence or whatever it might be. So, just taking those classes of laws, which were always sort of rushed through in times of national crisis, but then which stay on the statute, and which of course then also become used in all kinds of ways against other sort of, problem populations and dissidents and political radicals and so on, is that their modus operandi is to simply say, but that's not, we have free speech, but that's not speech anymore. That's something else. That library book that you took out about sort of Islamic radicalism, under the Prevent agenda, well, you're going to have to explain to us that library book you took out, because that looks to us as if it might be a potential sign of radicalization. And once we start to accumulate potential signs of radicalization, well, then you become somebody who is guilty of the potential of violence. And this is, again, as you can see, why I try to emphasize the kind of the communication theory aspects that run through these different sort of regimes of free speech. So if we just look at that sort of inverted commas war of terror era, thinking from 2001 and then sort of intensifying through to the 2000s, and then kind of adding France at the end in the mid 2010s, what you see is just, emergency state legislation, which doesn't just restrict speech, but criminalizes speech and securitizes speech, and does so also for very particular, of course, racialized populations in particular ways, but not only them. There's always the spillover risk, and there's always the spillover coercion and surveillance is available. Now, at the same time as that, of course, is what I was talking about earlier, which was the elevation of freedom of speech into a defining value of already settled, and this is the self-presentation, already settled liberal polities where gender discrimination and gender violence is, no longer really an issue, where, we have kind of broadly freedom of speech and we all rub along. All of these kinds of presentations of Britain, France, Denmark, Netherlands, wherever you turned at this time, as sort of already settled liberal polities. But the threat to that sort of liberal modus vivendi was those who were not capable, or those who were not willing to not just sort of live quietly by these values, but prove that they actually believed in them, prove that they would actually sort of effectuate them in society. And so that's where you started to get a politics that was built around two sorts of kind of, again, spectacles and set pieces. One was sort of prohibition. We're going to ban the headscarf, or we're going to ban minarets, or whatever it might be, as a way of protecting the liberal nature, the settled liberal nature of our polity, and as a way of doing something for these women in a society otherwise fully committed to gender equality and gender emancipation and so forth. So, it's also the production of mythology as a part and parcel of this kind of securitized, culturalized integration politics. And then the other side of that, of course, was the focus on freedom of speech. And that's more complex because, this did also emerge through those events that I was talking about, where there was significant reactionary violence aimed at, up to and including their murder by reactionary Islamists. So but what that pivots on is then that the security issue became turned into a cultural and civilizational one. That what motivates this violence is theological, and at the base of that theology is an intolerance for our way of life, where our way of life is defined by these ideas. So the politics, any politics that may be there, no matter how inchoate and reactionary, vanishes from the picture a lot of the time. Therefore, the counter to radicalization is, and this is where, the racialization is at its most potent, is that while we know, like adopting the state voice, while we know that it's only a tiny minority of Muslims that do these things, people in their communities must know who these people are. And therefore, it's up to the moderates, it's up to the integrated ones to tell us what's going on. And it's also up to the integrated ones and the moderate ones to more fully practice their commitment and more fully demonstrate to the rest of society their commitment to these values, which, magically by birth of sort of, whiteness and nativism, the rest of the population apparently subscribe to. So, this was a very sort of important kind of culturalized politics that was very, very kind of virulent for a couple of years, and that served very much to center freedom of speech as something that, magically in societies which would be beset by all of the kinds of problems that we've been talking about. And also in societies where I would mention one of the most obvious threats to free speech as a mode of political assembly is the deep intensification of police violence across all of the countries that I've been talking about. The preemptive attacks on protests by police is a very sort of widespread political reflex at the moment, and obviously an organized and strategized political reflex. So it's in these very societies, that on the one hand, as they're increasing the sort of criminalization and the securitization of speech, as they're making things more and more difficult for the media and for journalists, and also at the same time criminalizing and attacking protests, these were the very same societies that decided that freedom of speech was a defining civilizational characteristic. All the better, if you like, to constantly try to parse who belongs and who doesn't quite belong, or who belongs and who might never actually be able to prove themselves capable or willing of belonging.
So would you say the right to free speech itself is racialized?
Yeah, I think in very particular ways, of course, also in uneven ways it is. And I mean, maybe the example, that I could give to answer that, because it comes very much from the kind of argument that I was making. One of the things that I write about in the book is some of the work of Yassir Morsi, who writes out of Melbourne. And he has a lovely reflection in one of his essays. Again, I can pass on the reference for program notes or whatever. But he's a lovely reflection on kind of taking a taxi ride to an Australian news program after a terror attack somewhere in the world, so how this happens. A terror attack happens somewhere in the world, and then, the disparate and diverse Muslim population in a certain country becomes at some level answerable for it. They have to, demonstrate that, as they put it in France, you must demonstrate that you are not in solidarity with this. This was the kind of discourse which was active over the last few years. So Yassir is talking about taking his taxi ride there and thinking about how he wants to play this interview. In other words, what is it that I want to say, but also what is it that's possible for me to say by, the kind of existing form of this conversation, knowing what I'm going to be asked, knowing what others expect to hear from me, but not just the expectations of the journalists, which, kind of give voice to a particular kind of majority expectation around condemnation and distancing, himself and the community and everything else from these acts, but also thinking about that if he says the wrong thing, he increases the chance of some kind of retributive violence randomly on somebody the next day, that some woman is going to get her hijab pulled off on the street, all of the kinds of things which happen constantly in the aftermath of these kinds of attacks. So, this is the racialization of speech, in the sense that this is a form of closure which must be negotiated by somebody who's being asked to come and speak in already a very sort of particular and very charged and very difficult sort of way, is already asked to sort of present themselves in public in ways that are already very sort of charged and difficult. And then even within the sort of supposed openness of an interview and discussion, what it is possible to say and what it is possible not to say, depending on the consequences and the reactions, which are, you're almost certain that you or somebody else will suffer the next day. This is, one way in which we could think about the racialization of speech. Absolutely. Well, some people can be invited free to air, but they have no capacity to speak freely because of the way in which they're being sort of communalized, essentialized, held responsible, asked to speak for, non-existent communities and so forth.
Yeah, another example you touch on in your book is an example of refugee populations like Behrouz Boochani, who managed to write a book from the Manus Island prison, managed to write it all through WhatsApp. But obviously, a lot of people in that situation, their access to any kind of communication is restricted just by default, similarly, people in prison. So there's a default lack of free speech for like a large amount of people. And we've also seen parallel to all of this, or, maybe more recently really started to bubble up, trans exclusionary radical feminists or TERFs have been defended again on the basis of free speech. And I've had more than one friend degenerate from defending TERFs' right to free speech to then fully embracing the most bigoted talking points about men with fetishes for women's clothing, that kind of thing. It goes from defending the right to free speech to just talking like, the worst bigot you've ever met. But yeah, do you have any comments on that, on the sort of TERF embrace of free speech, and whether that has any parallels or any links with the racist appropriation of free speech?
Yeah, definitely. I mean, I think the parallels are very pronounced. I might emphasize a couple of things that I've partly talked about before, but just to underline them. One, again, I think is the political attractiveness of this kind of heterodox positionality. In other words, seeking to gain legitimacy by positioning turf arguments as a kind of brave stand against orthodoxy. And, where you get the real parallel with racist discourse, or let's say with something like anti-multiculturalist discourse or whatever it might be, is that you've got to make a very particular move there. You've not just got to turn yourself into the kind of, minoritized, marginalized, heterodox position. You've got to turn those you're targeting into some form of orthodoxy. Sarah Ahmed has written brilliantly about this, for example, over many years. So what you've got to find is a way of trying to present trans people as if not exactly suddenly privileged, but suddenly that something, what they term trans ideology, is the orthodoxy. And it's really kind of distressing as well to see elements of the left get sucked into this by assuming, say, for example, that, the kind of very obvious corporate appropriations of, it's not a word I use or like at all, but, in the discourse, the kind of corporate appropriations of wokeness, so in other words, kind of demonstrating their fidelity to a range of different, as it's often called, kind of identity-based issues, as if that's all that's in question here. So, there's an assumption that because this is what corporations are doing, that this is somehow evidence of a wider shift in power relations. That really frustrates me to see that kind of move made, because what it does obviously is allied the discrimination and also, of course, the targeting that this involves for trans people and the way in which they experience that. And I think secondly, and this is very pronounced here, but it also has a wider valence, I think, or the way that freedom of speech gets mobilized here, is that what matters is speech, and speech as a kind of unmediated expression of conscience. I have to say it because I think it, and that's my freedom because that's what gives me autonomy. This gets completely separated from the content of speech, which is, of course, what we all pay attention to in the world. So first of all, that's always been kind of bizarre, the sort of viewpoint diversity or viewpoint neutrality sort of treatment of speech as sound in the air, graphic marks on the page, without thinking about the content. And, there's no contradiction, despite people thinking that there is. There's no contradiction, say, between standing up for somebody's right to say something and then making very, very clear that, you politically oppose it and mobilize against it. And yet that second part seems to be, so difficult for people, or also they evade it because they take refuge in this notion that what matters is the voicing, the writing, the expression, the articulation, not what is voiced, expressed and articulated. And so what that does then, and that has a number of kind of corollaries and effects, but I think one of the things that it also does, and this is where we can see the sort of, the traces of the kind of civilizational politics that I was talking about earlier, is that giving offense is regarded as almost a kind of a democratic duty. It's a mark of truth. Its truth is the kind of telos of free speech, because I'm not shying away from the difficult ideas, and I need to express these difficult ideas in sort of, whatever way that I feel is best in order to get them heard and get them taken seriously. And if you're offended, well, then just kind of suck it up. And again, it's a completely sort of self-satisfied and self-defeating kind of politics, because it evades the big political question, which is why certain people's lives are always the subject of debate. And one of the things that I really try to get at in the book is that being made constantly into the subject of debate is a form of violence, if we want to call it that, and being held up as a population or being held up as an identity or as, as somebody marked by an identity that is there for everybody else to debate in whatever way they like. And I really want to kind of challenge that politics of being made the subject of debate. And the second one is we really need to challenge, here, but also more broadly, this notion that being offensive and being deliberately offensive has some kind of democratic value. Why would it? Why would it? What kind of machismo, what kind of values are getting reified or normalized rather by that particular set of assumptions? So I think that the way that the speaking position is generated as already, always in danger of being silenced, and the way in which that then tries to produce, bigoted discourse as a particular kind of heterodox but truthful courage, and then the way in which it amplifies this sort of politics of offense as something good, offense as the mark of truth of an articulation. All of those things I think are very much present in those debates and can be tracked across the kind of stuff that I've been looking at.
Do you think the concept of free speech can be recuperated, or has it been captured too much by the racist right and other pernicious forces?
Yeah, I mean, I think it can, I think our speech practices and our speech politics can obviously practice important forms of fidelity to, maximizing speech, but then also starting to think through, the relationship of speech to being heard, the relationship of speech to the development of, collective forms of thought, collective processes of generating the kinds of ideas that, we need in political struggles and movements and everything else. I think freedom of speech is a kind of abstract demand extracted from an analysis of oppression and a discussion of, emancipation is not something that I find particularly pressing to recuperate myself. But I think, within it, there are aspects that could be, strategically recuperated. I mean, if we think of the way in which, let's say the broader grifter right is always on the lookout for safe spaces and these kinds of things as proof of the lack of democratic robustness and of identitarians, or as their commitment to ghettoizing themselves and identity groups, all of this kind of thing. Under the conditions, the kind of communicative conditions we're talking about, I think we need, if you like, more safe spaces. We need more places where people can have proper, meaningful, sustained dialogues, arguments, conversations, be they about understanding the world or be they oriented to ways of thinking about acting in the world. And this is very, very consonant with someone like Mill, who is very, very clear that the truth orientation of freedom of speech is only possible under the conditions of the seminar room, where people are there by their own volition, where they build a form of kind of interpretative community together, where the rules of interaction, the rules of the game, if you like, are agreed and people decide to abide by them. That sounds like a safe space to me. So, what I'm saying is that there are things within the tradition of thought that I find problematic that can also be used strategically to increase sort of democratic possibilities. But as I said, sort of doing battle over this particular term or way of thinking about speech and liberty and action in the world, I'm not that invested in that recuperation.
All right, and what else is to be done?
I don't know. I might just leave it there if that's okay before that last question. Just because,
The honesty is appreciated. Thanks for coming on. It's been very, very good to hear from you.
Yeah, I've really enjoyed it. And thanks a lot for all the work you did in preparing it and everything else, and the time zone shifting.
Yeah, we're across 3 continents.
Yeah, thank you. And I appreciate your distaste for having to use woke the way you had to there.
Yeah, I was trying to find another way of saying it, but I was like, okay.
By saying this, I'll unfortunately introduce it, but we also managed to avoid the phrase cancel culture. So I'm glad.
Yeah, exactly. I'd only go so far,
If you found this interview useful, please do pick up Gavin's book, of course titled Is Free Speech Racist? And if you have any spare cash after that, we'd appreciate if you can contribute to our Patreon at patreon.com/jetpack1917. And if you can't afford to contribute financially, a review at Apple Podcasts would also help us out. Good night and good luck.
And we'll see you in the future.
Saturday morning, I take a turn at the skillet. I burn some eggs, boil coffee, drink a cup, then refill it. I read some pages of the paper, mostly look at the pictures. There's a drip at the faucet, so I fumble with the fixtures. We take our own showers, wash our own hair, make our own beds, push in our own chairs. I thought all this stuff would get done for me. A robot mows along while I sit under a tree. I thought we'd control wind and rain, cure all sickness, eliminate pain. I wanted mind-reading gadgets to cater to my wishes. Wanted self-cleaning kitchens and non-sticking dishes. Where's the end of war? Freedom from disease. Where's the milk and honey? See the shining sea, and where are the crime-free cities? Rockets on our backs, so we're on the smooth-moving sidewalks. Hey, where's my jet? A hovercraft in every drive, instant breakfast on the table at 6:45. Rocket to the moon and race right back to my holograph and my new jet backpack. I was gonna watch your dreams on a flush-mounted giant plasma flat screen. We were gonna live forever with a wish and a pill and the pull of a lever. Heaven on earth in a God-free zone where we all get along and no one's alone. A paradise of plenty where nobody lacks. We all flying around with our own jet packs. Where's the end of war? Freedom from disease. Where's the milk and honey? You see the shining sea. How come there's rats in my kitchen, monkeys on my back? Where are the monorails and sky trams? Yeah, where's my jet? Heaven on earth in a God-free zone where we all get along and no one's alone. A paradise of plenty where nobody lacks. We all flying around with our own jet packs.